Recording.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. This is Julie Bloomquist. I'm with the Sql Server DBA Virtual Chapter. We are a past chapter. Wanted to welcome you today. The topic is The Bug Talk by Noam Brezis. My name is Julie Bloomquist, and our meeting is being sponsored by Dell. Oops. We are one of the many virtual chapters that PASS has. Here's a listing, and you would just go to your PASS login, log into the PASS organization, and you could associate yourself with any of these chapters, and you will just get the email reminders about upcoming meetings. Don't forget the PASS Business Analytics Conference is going to be April 20th to 22nd over in Santa Clara. You can still get some very good pricing on this conference. Oops. Sorry about that. Let's go one more. There are quite a few volunteering opportunities with the PASS organization, and they do have that listed on their website. And they are also looking for people to get nominated for the volunteer recognition for the Outstanding Volunteer Awards and the Passion Awards. You know, if you're interested, there's always opportunities, especially with the virtual chapters.
Well, it's been brought to our attention that some of that data in the database, for one thing, it may be other files as well, we don't know, but in the database there is extremely sensitive information.
So today, well, I missed correcting this slide. Sorry about that. Noam's going to be talking about the bugs, and he is a SQL Server consultant at Madeira Consulting in Services in Israel. He's got over 10 years of experience in the high-tech field, and he enjoys a wide knowledge range from the Visual C# to C++, .NET, VB, Unix, Oracle, and a deep understanding of the Microsoft SQL Server. In his work, Noam deals on a daily basis with a broad clientele such as banks, universities, and large-scale companies and startups, where he's designing, developing, and troubleshooting their SQL Server systems. He also performs as one of the main teachers of the Technion Institute, Israeli Institute for Technology of SQL Server, the DBA program, besides being a course developer and a conductor for the ongoing business. So I'm going to change it over to you, Noam, and you should be able to present your screen. This presentation is being recorded. It will be then uploaded to the DBA Virtual Chapter archive page. Noam also, I guess it was last month, did a presentation on index fragmentation, which is over under the DBA Virtual Chapter under the Performance chapter. So keep an eye out on these, on the archive pages. You'll find the recordings of the meetings. We will be holding the questions until the end. And over in the chat window, if you take a look, you'll see there's a link to the website that has the materials that you could download.
Thank you, Julie. So hi to everybody. I hope you can see me on the webcam. So my name is Noam Brezis, and I work at Madeira. It's a company based in Israel, but an international company, and it offers SQL Server services. And I'm going to talk to you today about SQL Server Bugs. And the idea was really to combine and to get together all sorts of bugs that I saw that were happening while working with SQL Server, and I thought it would be a really good idea to put them together in one webinar. So we're going to talk about bugs that are related to data types, linked server, single user mode, triggers, partitioning. So as you can see, there's going to be a wide range of all sorts of bugs, and I hope you're really going to enjoy it. So let's start with bugs that are related to data types. And you can see I was asked to run a really simple query and to gather birth dates of our customers, which had an ID lower than 100. And you can see, so we have here all these birth dates, but I was asked to take these birth dates and to concatenate them into one variable. So of course, very simple task, just had one variable declared, and with a simple select concatenate each time the birth dates. Now, when running it, of course, there's a problem, but that's not a bug. That's totally normal. We want to convert a date to an varchar, so it can't be done implicitly, so we'll have to explicitly do this cast. And now we're going to run the very simple query. And you can see it's pretty weird, but we're getting only one value. You should be pretty shocked now, because let's go back and run the query again. And as you can see here, we have all the rows. So how come when we're running it, exact same query, just concatenating into a string, we're getting only one value? If anybody has an idea why it's happening, you can feel free and just put it on, in the chat and write it down. But let's have a look at something interesting. If we take off the order by and run it again, we get all the values. And this is exactly what we wanted, but we wanted the order by with birth date, so it's not fully what we want. And so after looking it down, you can see that actually the problem is not related directly to the order by, but more related to the cast to nvarchar. Let's run it again this time, not using nvarchar max, but rather just using and casting to nvarchar with a specific amount. And you can see that in this case it works like a charm and it works well. So actually the problem is not about the order by, but it's because we have both the cast to nvarchar max and the order by in our query that we didn't get all the birth dates, but we got only the last birth date. So be very careful, because it's pretty hard to find when you have, running in your system. It's a very simple piece of code, and it can be somewhere in a large store procedure, for instance, and it's pretty hard to really get it down and to find it. So be careful when you're concatenating strings and you're having a cast to nvarchar. Don't use the nvarchar max, but instead just convert and cast it to nvarchar with a specific number. Okay, so I hope that was like a start with the first bug. Let's continue and see other problems that we might have with strings. So you can see here we have again a very simple code. I started with simple stuff where we have just a variable of type varchar 20, and we have a hello, and we're going to concatenate the world, just the word world to it. And you can see we have the regular hello world that we have in every first school programming class. But now let's do it with the car. Now you're thinking, when I did it, I thought, okay, so we have a car 20, meaning that in this variable we could have enough characters to have both the hello, the space, and the world, of course. So it should work fine. But hey, again, we have a problem, unexpected problem. This actually, I'm not sure it's really a bug. It's more something it's important for us to know. But let's have a look and see what's the length of hello, because where's the world? There's a problem here. Let's run and see what's the length of hello, and it's 5 characters. So why doesn't it work? Again, if anybody has an idea why, really feel free to write it down on the chat and I'm going to read it. But let's look and see what about the data length. If we're going to run it, you can see that this time we see that really the space allocated for our variable is actually 20 characters. So another small thing we can do is just look at the value. I just copied it from here, and let's paste it down, and you can see what's happening. Actually, there are trailing spaces. The moment we declared a variable of type char20, although we only assigned it with a smaller string, we're still going to get, since it's not varchar, we know it's going to be exactly 20 characters. So in some cases, something like in some way, it's something that expected, but not always we think about it. So actually what we're going to get is a string and all these trailing spaces inside. And now we're doing and concatenating the world string. It's going to be placed after all these spaces. And of course, there's no way we can put more than 20 characters in a variable. So that's the reason we don't see the hello world. If you have some problems with the audio, if you can't hear me well, please write it down in the chat. So maybe I can change and remove the webcam, which will make it maybe better. Now, another issue is what about the length? You can see that actually we got only 5 characters, right? The reason for that is length actually doesn't count down, it doesn't count all these trailing spaces, and that's the reason that we got the 5. So there's really hello with all these spaces, but when we run the function length, we'd actually only get all the letters without these trailing spaces, and that's why we got 5. Okay, cool. So let's continue with our next bug. This one is a little bit more advanced, but I'm sure we can understand it pretty well. I'm going to take now this query, and I'm going to run it. As you can see, I have 2 instances. I have the instance of SQL 2014, and I have another one, which is 2012. So I just want to change my connection just for a sec to the 2012. And I'm going to run this query, and I'm going to look at the estimated execution plan. And just so you know, in my orders table, I have a lot of orders from the past maybe 2, 3, 4 years, but definitely I don't have any row which is previous 150 years ago. So definitely there's going to be no rows that will return. We can run it even. You know what? We're going to run this query, and you can see, of course, there's no row that returns from this query. But why SQL Server is running a scan, and if you're going to have a look, you can see the estimated number of rows. And you can see that the estimated number of rows is 1 million, which is exactly the amount of rows that are in my table. So how come? Something is weird here, right? I mean, and statistics are fine. It's not about statistics. Something is happening, and for some reason, when we're running it, SQL Server thinks there's 1 million rows that's going to come from the table. And that, of course, might have a lot of impact. If we're going to do some join with some other tables, we might get a real bad plan. Now let's do a very small change. Let's change it to get date. And now I'm going to run the query again. Of course, the result is exactly the same. The only thing is that get date, instead of having the date time to data type, we're having the date time data type. So here we can see we have a completely different plan. And if we're going to look at the amount of rows that this time SQL Server estimates, we can see it understands this time that there's going to be almost no results. So actually this time it works well. And this is something that might have critical impact on performance of your system. And it's really weird because you're saying, wait, the only difference is using this is datetime, which is actually datetime 2, which is better, right? That's the new data type we're supposed to use. So it's really important to know when if you're using SQL Server 2012 or previous versions, you should know that there was a bug. And thank God that they fixed it. And now, if you're using SQL Server 2014, I'm going to run the exact same query. And you can see that this time, SQL Server estimates correctly that the amount of row is very low. So they fixed it, and I think it's very important fix because we had so many queries running slowly just because we used the datetime 2, and a lot of customers were very frustrated because they thought it would be much better to use this new data type, but actually performance was downgraded. So very important. If you're using SQL Server 2012 or previous versions, be careful when you're doing these sorts of queries. Now, I better explain what exactly happened. Actually, when SQL Server Engine gets this query, the optimizer, instead of taking into account that there's the date add with the sys date time, it just thought that the query, when it did the estimation of the amount of rows, it just looked at a query without the date add. So this is actually what the estimation was, and the optimizer was thinking, okay, how many rows are there that are previous to today? And all the rows are previous, and that's why the estimation was to have such big amount of rows. If we're going to have a look and change the query, and now we'll have a look at all the rows that have a bigger date and time than 150 years ago, of course we're going to get all our table, right? Because we're going to get all our rows, but the estimation, you're just going to see it in a second after the query finishes, is that there are no rows at all. And again, the reason is, if we'll just remember, it's that the optimizer, when it looked at this query, it looked at it if it's going to look for all the rows with a date and time that is after today, and that's why we get no rows. So again, the estimation is completely wrong, and this can have big impact on performance. So again, if you're with 2014, that's fine, that's perfect. But if you have 2012 previous versions, be careful when you have these sort of date add and sysdate time predicates. Okay, so let's continue and see more bugs, this time related to linked servers. So when are we going to use linked servers? If we want to get some information that is not from our instance, right? So we're going to create, as you all know, a linked server in our server objects. This time I just did for this demonstration, I just added a simple linked server from my 2014 instance, and I have a linked server to my 2012 instance. So if you run, you can see I'm just going to run a very simple query. I'm going to change the connection just back to 2014 for a sec. And I'm going to use my linked server to get the information. But you can see it doesn't work. And the problem is that there's a column of type XML in my table orders. If we're going to have a look, we can see that there's in Sale4You sales orders, we have a column of type XML. And actually, one of the problems is that we can't read information of type XML through linked server. But the problem is, as you can see here, it's that it's not only reading, I don't want to read at all the information that's related to XML. I want another column in that table, just the ID, which is an integer, but yet I still can't get that information. So just the fact that there is one column of type XML blocks from reading the whole table through link server, which of course is pretty crazy. So one option you can have, to work around this bug is to create a view on the remote server. So in this case, I'm just going to connect to my 2012 instance, and I can create this view. And now our view will have a select of all the columns, but without the column of type XML. We're going to just, have a look quickly and see. You can see that we have here our table, and you can see that I have the additional info column of type XML. So I'm going to take all the other columns except that one, and I'm going to create the view. Okay, so it was already created previously, and now I'm just going to read the data that I want, and it works well. So that's a sort of workaround. Another option you can do is just use the open query. And if you use the open query, you can run a specific query on your remote server. And this way, this query, which doesn't have any, it doesn't take any information from the XML column. And this time, if I'm going to run the query, using the open query, it will run just fine because the XML has no impact on this query, and actually Sql Server doesn't even take into account that column. So that's a pretty cool workaround. I think it's a pretty good solution in a lot of the cases. What else you can do if you really want to get the column with the XML, well, again, you're really in a problem. You can't just pass that information. What you can do is to cast the data of type XML to nvarchar max to get it through the open query and cast it back to XML. And that works fine. So that's a solution, sort of workaround. So if you need to pass the XML information, don't be frustrated. Just you can use the open query, and that's a sort of workaround to get the information from one server to the other. Now let's continue and talk about timeouts. It's going to be timeouts. I'm going to first talk about timeouts in general, and then I'm going to go deep into timeouts related to linked servers. But let's start with just simple timeouts. If I want to have a timeout through Management Studio, how do I get this timeout configured? Each client can have a timeout and say that if a query takes more than a certain amount of time, we want to get an exception. Well, Management Studio in this case, of course, is a client. So if you go to Tool Options, you can see through the query execution, there's the execution timeout. So we can say that if the query takes more than 3 seconds, we want to get an exception and to stop running the query. And that configuration is on the client side. And let's run the query. So we should get, of course, a timeout now, since it's going to take more than 3 seconds. Something's not working. But it's okay. Remember, we're talking about bugs, right? So we're fine. Let's have a look what's happening here. Actually, this option here in the query execution doesn't work. And what you should use to have, if you want your connection through Management Studio to really have a timeout, the same that all applications have, you can just have in your connection, change your connection details, and open the options. And now you can see that you have the execution timeout. This time, let's try it again with 3 seconds. Let's run the query. And this time, it's going to work. So finally, it works well. We know now where we have our timeout. But what happens if we want to catch this exception? If we're going to put a try and catch, will we get the exception, and can we decide not to have the exception, or to handle the error at least in some way? Well, you can see that we can't do anything. And the reason is that the timeout is configured at the client side. So if there is an exception in these cases, we can't catch it through a try catch. But what we can do, we really can decide that we want to do something different in case that we have this timeout. But we can do something different. In some cases, we have an option to catch an exception if we have a timeout. And let's have a look how it works. It's the set lock timeout. So first of all, I'm going to remove the timeout that we configured. And we're going to set the lock timeout to 5 seconds. So if we're going to run now a wait for a delay of 10 seconds, the query will take, of course, more than 5 seconds. And let's have a look what happens. You can already see that it took more than 5 seconds. We didn't get anything, no timeout. Now the reason is the lock timeout is not about any timeout like the regular client timeout that we just saw a second ago. This one is about locks. It's different. And actually this is not a client-side timeout, but it's server-side. And actually we can have control exactly of what we want to happen in case we have the timeout. We'll see that in just a second. But in the meantime, let's see how it works. So I'm going to set the lock timeout to 5 seconds like we did just a second ago, but I need to create some lock, right? So let's take this query and I'm going to run it on a different session. And so you see we have a begin transaction, a very simple update. And since we haven't done any commit, the row is locked. So now, if I'm going to select the row, we're going to wait. And you can see that we got the lock request timeout period exceeded. And we got the 5 seconds because this is exactly the lock timeout that we had beforehand. But you know what? There's something small I want to show you before. Just it's a small deviation, but I think it might be pretty interesting. I'm going to change back to the 2014 version, and you're going to see something a bit different than what we just saw a second ago. And I think it's pretty interesting, so I want to show it to you. Look, we'll do exactly the same thing. We have the same table, so it's pretty simple. I'm going to change the connection. And I'm going to do the same thing. So we have the transaction, and we're locking the row with an exclusive lock. And let's run the select. Wow, that's completely different, right? Just a second ago, we had a lock on that row, and now when I'm using 2014, I don't see any lock. That's pretty weird. But just a small thing, it's not a bug. Actually, it's really something, it's a feature, it's pretty good. Let's have a look. Now, the first thing when I saw that, I was like, wait, there is no lock? That's pretty weird. So, of course, the first thing was to look and see if we have any locks. So we can go and check if there's any lock for this given session. So let's have a look. At dimtran locks, and you can see that actually we do have a lock. We have an exclusive lock on this row. So it's pretty weird, right? In 2014, the reason that we don't see any block caused by this exclusive lock is that actually we didn't change the value. If I'm going to have a look just what's the value before we made the change, I'm going to do a rollback. And let's just have a look at what's the value there. You can see that the value is new value 12. And we did the same update with the same value. And SQL Server recognized that we didn't change the value. So there's an exclusive lock, but since we didn't change the value, still we can read the information that's there. I think it's pretty cool. I actually have no idea how they implemented it, but I think I just saw it using this demonstration and I thought it would be pretty interesting to see. So now let's put another value in. We have the update inside our transaction, and now if we're going to run just the select, of course will be locked, and as you can see, since we have the lock timeout, you know what, I'll put the lock timeout this time since we were first connected to another instance, and here we get it after 1 second, so it's working. And this time you can see that if you're using the lock timeout, you can really catch the exception since it's not a client-side configuration, but it's something that you've done in your code on the server. So I think it's in some cases, it's very useful to use this lock timeout and to say, in case we're waiting now on a lock for a long time, we can decide we want to run a different piece of code. And it's really very, very useful in some cases, and I don't see too many people use it, so I think that just people are not aware about it. So if you need it, remember there's the lock timeout. Now all this is still not related to linked server. Let's see what happens in linked server. So there is a configuration called remote query timeouts, and we're going to just configure it to 5 seconds. And what it means is that now we're going to do a timeout when we're going to run a query on a remote server. So I'm just going to run this query again like we had before on our 2012 instance. And I'm going to block the session running in our 2014 instance. And you can see now, so of course the row is locked, and so we're waiting, and it took 5 seconds, and after these 5 seconds, since we had the blocking, we just had the exception, and we could catch that exception. So again, it's an exception on the server side, and that's why we can catch that exception, and we can decide what we want to do in case we're waiting too long. Now, what I've done here is running there's a store procedure on my remote server, which takes a lot of time. We're going to run it this time, and you're going to see it should be exactly the same thing, right? Because we're just running store procedure on a remote server, but you can see that this time we couldn't catch the exception. And that's a bug, and that's something that if you're familiar with running code on a remote server, it's very important to notice and to know that actually the try and catch doesn't work in these cases. And if you want to make it work, you really have to run it through the open query. And at that case, you'll get the exception and everything will be fine. So it's important to notice that when you're running store procedure on a remote server, you're not going to get your exception through the try catch. So be aware of it, because it might be something very important if you're using linked servers. Okay, so let's continue. Oh, there's one small thing just since I was talking about linked servers, which I think is also pretty important. As you know, in your linked server properties, you have an option about the security context. How do you want, when you're entering your remote server, with what security context do you want to log in the remote server? Be aware, very, very dangerous to use the be made using this security context, because actually there is no way to say that certain logins or certain users cannot use the linked server. So you can't block people from using this linked server. And now if people, they can be, what you can do is tell them not to see this linked server. But what you can't do is you can't really block people from using it. So this is a very known security break, and be careful, because if you're going to use this be made using the security context, people, if they guess in some way the name of your link server or get it from some other way, it could be very dangerous, and they can connect to a remote server using this link server. So don't use it that way. It's much better to use it in different, with a different configuration. And I think the best one definitely would be using it with the same security context as the current login. I mean this one, yes, be made using the login's current security context. Okay, let's continue and see other bugs that we have. And one thing I wanted to show you was about using the single user mode in databases. So a lot of time people use it if they want to do all sorts of stuff. And for instance, if you want, if you decide you don't want anymore to have your database and you want to remove it, or for all sorts of reasons you want to make some changes and you don't want anybody to be connected except you to this database. So one of the options are, of course, to use the single user mode. And you know what, I'm just going to for a second change to Sql 2014. It's going to be easier. Okay. So we're going to run it again. And as you can see, I'm going to create the database and I'm going to put it in single user mode. And you'll see in a second that my database is created and it's in a single user mode. So till now everything is good. Let's see actually what does it mean if it's in a single user mode, if I'm going to connect now with a different session, and let's change to our database, to our single user demo database. Well, that's a bit weird, right? Because actually no one is using this database. If I'm going to have a look, our demo here, we're not using the single user demo, right, database, and nobody is. Let's have a look if any session is using this database. And you can see no one is using this database. So why can't I access the database? It's pretty weird, right? I mean, it's in a single user mode, but from this connection and now from any new connection, I can't access that database. But just a small thing, if we're going to look at locks, that's actually the reason. And the reason we can't access the database is because it's already locked. But who's locking it? If we're going to have a look, we can see that the session locking it is actually the session that changed the database to the single user mode. And the reason, and actually I think that's a pretty good idea and a good implementation of SQL Server, is that if you're changing the database to a single user mode, automatically you're locking it. And now, even if you're not going to select it and you're not going to use this database currently, you're still locking it and preventing from other people to catch and take your database. And so now if you want, you can, for instance, change the name of the database or whatever you want, and it's really, you can access it from this session, but not from other sessions. Of course, if I'm going to disconnect and I'm going to connect again, then of course my lock is going to be lost. And now other sessions can connect to that database and I won't have the option. So if you're taking a database and putting it in single mode, very important, don't disconnect and connect again. Just do whatever you intend to do in the same session. So till now it's pretty good, but there are situations, and I've seen it already many times, in which people change the database to a single user mode, and what happened is that they had a system session running some process and taking the database, and now they couldn't connect again to that database, and they were completely blocked. And I'm sure a lot of you are now like saying, yeah, it happened to me, exactly the same thing. And it's common, and that's the reason I think it's very important to understand that it's better not to use the single user mode. I really dislike it, and I think there are other options which are much better. For instance, just if you want to change the name of the database, then just change the name of the database. Don't put it into a single user mode. And you're sure if you have a different name, nobody else will connect to that database. So I think it's a better option. And because what happened is that the system process might be really blocked in that database, and now you can't access anymore. And the only solution is to do a restart, and that's pretty bad. Another option which might work, but doesn't always work, is to try this: kill stats, job, and the job ID that you'll find in the DMV. And that's actually what's happening, is that many times what's the process, the system process taking your database is actually the statistics updates. So one option is to disable it before disabling the automatic update statistics on your database, or if you're already blocked in that situation, so you can try and do the kill stats, but from experience, it doesn't always work. Okay, let's continue. If you have any questions, you can of course write them down in the chat, and later on, well, just before I finish, I'll answer all these questions. Let's have a look at something different: triggers. Now, in this example, you can see I'm going to use triggers of type logon. So a logon trigger is actually when if you want to have a sort of auditing or a mechanism that each time that somebody logins in your instance, you can write it down in a table, like in this example where I created a trigger for logon, and each time somebody's going to log in, we're going to run our code. Now, it's pretty dangerous, because what happens if the trigger has an exception inside, or if the transaction doesn't work well, for instance, if there's a rollback somewhere, the session that is trying to connect is actually not going to be able to connect to the server. So it's a very good mechanism, but also pretty dangerous. Let's have a look and see what might happen and what bug might happen in this sort of triggers. So we're going to create a trigger and just enter each information of each login that logins in our system and put it in our table. Let's see what happens. Let's connect now in a different session. Whoa, there's a problem. It says it can't connect due to trigger execution. Well, now we're really blocked. Of course I can come back to our session, but let's say I disconnected. What's my options? How can I get back to our server? So let's say we're going to try and connect to the server through the Object Explorer. Of course it's not going to work again, but let's try to use the dock, which should pass through and go around all these triggers, logon triggers, and let us in. But again, the dedicated administrator connection also can go in, but this time it says because there are multiple connections, and it can do multiple connections for dedicated administrator connections. That's pretty weird, right? I just tried to enter through the Object Explorer, so why did it happen? Well, just important, and I think it's really important to know that when you want to get in with the dock login, then at that time what you have to do is really what's important is not to do it through the Object Explorer. You should do it through a new query. So for instance, I'm going to just disconnect, and if I'm going to connect through the dock, let's try it again. It should work. Okay, let's try it just one time. I'm going to do a new connection. I have to say this time, normally it works well, but I see that this time it doesn't let me log in. I'll just have a look just for a second to see if there's any options. Let's see one. So I have to say it worked well in all my previous examples. Pretty weird that it's not working here. You know what? I'm going to try just a second, one more last time, and see if it's going to work. No. Okay. So I have to say that's pretty weird, but I don't have now the time to figure it out. But what we're going to do is we're just going to drop the trigger, and what I want to show to you, the true bug that I want to show you, an important thing, is that if you're going to use a try and catch inside the trigger, so let's understand what happened there. Actually, when we tried to insert some information in our table, what happened is that this table doesn't exist. And if we're going to have a look, we can see that we don't have the login info 2 in our table. We don't have that table. We have the login info, but not the number 2. So actually there was an exception, and that's why we had an exception in our trigger and we couldn't get into a server. But now if I'm going to create this trigger with the begin, try, and catch, now what we should see is that actually we should be able to connect to our server and everything should be fine, since the exception will be handled and we can connect to our server. So I hope this time it's going to work. Oh no, again it doesn't work. But this time that's the bug. And actually what's happening, and it's important to know, in triggers you can't use the try and catch option. You can't handle exceptions at all. Doesn't matter what sort of exception. So if you're going to have even a select, for instance, with a division by 0, and you want to connect, you can see again you have the error. And actually, it doesn't matter if it's a Logon trigger or any other sort of triggers. You can't use the try catch. I mean, you can write it down in your code, and I think that's the big problem, that you're sure now that you're handling your errors, but actually, if you're in a trigger, you won't catch your exceptions. And it doesn't matter if it's a Logon trigger or just any trigger on a table for, any sort of, if you have an update trigger or insert, doesn't matter, you're going to have this problem. So be careful. Don't use try and catch in triggers. It's written, by the way, in books online, so it's not really a bug. It's something that is known. But I think that since people really can have the option to have the try and catch inside triggers, I think Sql Server should have told us at least that it's not possible. So be careful. Don't use try and catch inside triggers. It just doesn't work. You can't handle any exception inside triggers. Okay, so let's continue and see our last part about partitioning. I think it's very important because a lot of us use partitioning, and you're going to see here an example of something that we're not always very aware of and can have huge impact of performance. So we're going to just create our partition function, our partition schema. And we have the table which uses our partition schema, and we're just going to insert some information in our table. You can see I'm just inserting 1 million rows of information from August 2014 for 200 days. And now if I'm going to look down and see all the rows that I have, you can see that they are well dispersed in our partition table. So that's fine. Everything is good. We have a very regular partition table, and we just created a clustered index on our ID on that table. And let's have a look at a very simple query which takes all the rows between two dates. Now, of course, we're taking dates only in January 2015, so it should make a partition selection and not read all the information, but read only from the specific partition that is of January 2015. But if we're going to have a look, you can see that actually all the partitions were accessed. So actually there is no partition elimination, and SQL Server didn't realize it can take information only from January 2015, and there's really nothing special about this query. By the way, if I'm going to look at the set statistics IO just to see how many rows and how many pages are read, you can see that really all the information, I can tell you because I know the whole table is this amount of pages and it reads really the whole table. So actually there's a scan on the whole table, and instead of going to the specific partition, you see that there is no partition elimination. So why is that? That's pretty weird, and it's sort of queries you're running all the time and you expect to have here partition elimination. And actually the reason, let's have a look when we run the query, but this time we're doing a cast to datetime 2. And you can see that this time the partition elimination worked, and that solved the problem. That's exactly how we expect it to work. And the reason for the difference is only this cast. But we expect it to be different, right? So that's, I think, is very important to be aware. It only happens if you're using a column of type datetime 2. In that cases, the elimination doesn't work if you're not going to do a cast. So be aware. If you have these sort of queries, be very careful. There is no partition elimination, and it might have big impact of performance if you're not going to do the cast. So don't forget to do the cast. One last bug, and we're finished, is about just doing a very simple query and finding what's the max ID of our table. So it was pretty quick, but if we're going to have a look at the amount of pages, again you can see that the whole table was scanned. And you can see that there is an index scan on that table. Now for very large table, it can take forever. It takes so much time. Because SQL Server, for a very simple task, actually should have done an index seek and really get to the maximum ID just by using our B tree and using our index, and to get to that row very simply. But as you can see, there was a scan. So this is also a very known bug, and you should be aware of it. There is a workaround you can find here in the Connect opened on that bug, and you can see there are sort of workarounds, but I didn't find any that was really perfect, so still waiting to have that bug fixed. So I'm going to do a very quick conclusion of what we saw. Related to timeouts, we saw for application timeout, we can't use the try and catch. For the lock timeout, we can, and for linked servers timeouts, we can also use the try and catch and decide how to handle the exception. And in general, what we saw that when we're concatenating strings with a select statement, and we had the cast to nvarchar max, remember we had only the last row, so the solution was to use nvarchar with the number inside and not the max. We saw that char, not the varchar, but the char data type, has pre-allocation of trailing spaces. So again, it's very important. If you're going to do some concatenation, it won't work. When you're using a predicate with date add and sysDateTime, we saw that we had an incorrect estimated number of rows, and the reason was the sysDateTime is using the datetime2 data type, and that was fixed in 2014. So if it's only important to have changed the sysDateTime to get date if you're using 2012 or earlier versions. We saw that, oh, actually this demo we didn't see about the decimal, so I'm going to go over it. We saw that we can't select from a table containing XML column when you're using a linked server, and we saw that there are some nice workarounds using the open query. And again, we saw that timeout using linked server with the sort procedure doesn't raise any exception. And we saw that we can use the open query, and that also fixes that problem. And the single user mode, I told you I couldn't show it, but that many times you're locked by internal system process. I think the best is really just not to use the single user mode, but instead to change the name of the database. That would be much easier and avoid these problems. And use triggers. In triggers, we saw that try catch doesn't work, so be careful. When you're using triggers, don't even try to catch these exceptions. And in partitions, we saw that there is no partition elimination when using implicit conversion to datetime too, so don't forget to use the cast there. And last, we saw that using the minimum maximum in a partition table scans the whole table, and again, we have some problems there. So I think that's it. If we still have the time, maybe I have one more demo, but Julie, tell me if that's fine or there are questions.
No, you're fine. There's very few questions, and since you did that summary review, they probably got answered.
Okay,
go ahead.
Very cool. So I'm going to show just the last thing. Let's create okay, we have already the table. You know what? I'm just going to drop it. And let's create a table. And we're going to just have two decimal variables, and we're going to insert just the division between the two. And you can see that we have, so we divided these numbers, and we have the value in our table, so it's 0.74. Now what we're going to do is very simple. Think in a scenario in which now you want to retrieve that row just by taking these two values, again dividing them, and selecting the row that equals to the value. But that's weird. We didn't get that row, right? That's very weird. We divided these two numbers. It's exactly the same numbers. You can see we're dividing them, and let's check we have that row. Yeah, it's there. And it's very weird that it doesn't work. Now, the reason is, let's have a look. When we're dividing these two numbers, what's the real value? Actually, you can see that the difference is related to the precision that we're having. And you can see that actually what happened is that we have a different data type. Since decimal, you can decide exactly the precision and the scale that you want. You can see that in our case, we have a different precision, right? Precision is the amount of digits that we'll have in our number. And you can see here, or the maximum amount of digits that we'll have in our number. So you can see that in our original case, we had 5 with a scale of 2, meaning that we have 2 digits after the dot. So in our case, what is actually happening, in our table we have 0.74, right? Because our scale is 2. I'll show it just again. We have 0.74, sorry. But when we're calculating the number itself, we're getting a different data type. And that's why SQL Server actually doesn't find the row that we were looking for. So the solution is very simple. If we're going to do, again, a cast of the value of the division between these two numbers to decimal with a precision of 5 and a scale of 2, you can see that we're going to get our row. So be very careful. And these things can have a lot of implications about when you're working with, billing stuff, and it might have a lot of implications and very, create large differences when you're calculating and aggregating information. So be careful, and don't forget, if you're using decimal, be aware that you should use the cast if you're doing such operations. And I think that's it. So I hope you enjoyed this webinar. And if you have any questions, so just write them down in the chat. And thank you very much.
Thank you. There are a few questions. The one is on your first example with the varchar max.
Yes.
Where the solution was to use the varchar. In that example, it was for the date time. With the example used a date time. Is the problem only with date time, or is it with other types of data?
No, actually, it's pretty crazy. it doesn't matter even if you're going to use that. I'll just show if I have just
Sure.
one more second. Yeah, okay, cool. So you can have a look. I'll actually even, let's look at the table customers. And you can see here we have the name. And name actually is already varchar. So if I'm going to use name, of course, you would expect to have no problems. I'll just put it back and let's see what happens. You can see we again have only one customer, although we have many customers there. So it actually doesn't matter on the type of your original column. It's for any type. The only thing is if you're going to use the cast and varchar max, then you'll have the problem. Okay? Just one little thing. If you're going to use your primary key, it will work. But it's really, even actually it doesn't work this time. So you should be really aware that there is this problem. It's weird because it worked for me once, but now apparently there's a problem. So really be aware not to use the cast and varchar max when you're concatenating strings.
Okay, you had one example where you were using system date or timestamp. The question is,
Yes.
Do you get the same problem with current underscore timestamp?
That's a very good question. I have no idea, but we can, I can follow up and just, if the person can send me an email or check it out, you have the scripts and we can check it out and see, but I don't know. It's a good question.
And then how do you fix your current logon trigger problem? Do you have to remove it from the already connected session?
Yeah. Actually, that's the only option is really to drop the trigger from the current session. Normally, I could access using the dedicated, the doc connection, which is weird. I couldn't do it this time. Actually, I've done it many times and it worked perfectly. I have no idea why I had the problem this time. But normally you can use, the doc connection and the dedicated administrator connection. But for some reason here I couldn't work it out. Normally you could and just drop the trigger. I'm going to have a look again and see why I had the problem now. It's pretty weird. But normally you can just connect from there and drop the trigger. I have to say that because we couldn't use try and catch in the Logon trigger, and actually you can't handle these exceptions, it's very problematic to use Logon triggers if you're not 100% sure your code has no errors. So be very careful when you're using them. Actually, we had exactly this code, and because we used the program name, one sort of client couldn't connect. Everything worked out, but if they were using a specific language, I don't remember, I think it was Python, at that moment they couldn't log in. And there was this exception, and it didn't matter if we used the try and catch, we couldn't handle that exception, and they couldn't log on into the system, to the server. So for us, that was really a no-go for Logon trigger in that case. So be very careful with that.
And we just got a last question. Can we catch errors in procedures inside the trigger?
I think it's not going to work either. I think it won't work, but I never tried it out. That could be, I could try to be a very cool solution, but my feeling is that it won't matter if we're going to run now a store procedure. I don't think it's going to help in any way, but I'm not 100% sure because I haven't tried it. But at the moment we'll finish here, I'm going to check it out.
Well, thank you very much. This was a great presentation. We had some good responses and kind of gives you an idea of what to keep an eye out on in SQL 2012 and what's been resolved in 2014 and what hasn't. We appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the lecture. Once again, the presentation will be uploaded to the DBA Virtual Chapter archive page. Feel free to look at the other recordings, as well as Noah also did a presentation, I think it was November, for the performance chapter. And that was on fragmentation, index fragmentation, and that's on their archive site as well. So Here it is.
Thank you, Julie. Yeah, you can see it on the screen right now.
Right. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll work on getting this uploaded today or tomorrow. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.